Well, actually, it's great to be here, and it's terrific to follow Jeff, because the story I want to tell is very much related to the story he told. It's very much about prevention and the state of our science. It actually builds nicely, I think, on Tom Insel's talk as well. I would disagree a little bit in terms I think we actually know a lot of stuff that we don't do. What I found in trying to explain this to people, so this notion of prevention, it's very helpful to think about the 1880s and when we were having terrible cholera epidemics, right? In the 1880s, 100,000 people in London died from cholera. And at the time, we thought that that was caused by miasmas, by bad air. People didn't know what was actually causing it. But through careful epidemiological work done actually by an epidemiologist named John Snow, he determined that it was actually something going on in the water that was making people. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew if he took the pump handle off the Broad Street pump, he predicted that cholera would dramatically reduce, and it did. It wasn't until 30 years later that Pasteur and Cook identified the cholera bacillus and started to understand what we needed to do to effectively treat infectious disease. The public hygiene movement that came from that revolutionized everything. Nothing has had a more profound effect on our health than public hygiene, cleaning up the water, making our food safe. And I want you to imagine, take yourself back to that time and think about saying, okay, well, we understand now there's something in the water, and it's something with human waste contaminating the water that seems to be making people sick. So how are we going to fix that? Well, let's do this. Let's take clean water and a pipe system and put a pipe into everyone's house so that everyone can have clean water, right? And you know what else we should do while we're doing that? Is let's put another pipe in every one of those houses and let's move all that sewage out and don't dump it out into the street the way we've been doing, but actually treat it. Can you imagine how likely you think that what people would say, you're out of your mind. You think we're going to be able to put a pipe into everybody's house and another pipe coming out? But we had a theory. We had a strong theory. We had strong community involvement in trying to understand and deal with these issues, and we did it, right? And now we take that whole public hygiene movement pretty much completely for granted. Now, my hypothesis for you today is that our contemporary epidemics, and this relates very much to what Bruce was just talking about, our contemporary epidemics are all behavioral. And I basically want to make 3 points today. The first point is we're in a hell of a mess. And I'm going to document that for you in lots of different ways. The second point is the good news, and that we know an awful lot about what we can do to start to change these situations. But it's going to sound to you as though I'm saying, look, all you need to do is put a pipe into everybody's house, right, and another pipe coming out. At the time, that had to seem unbelievable. But we actually have very strong prevention science that guides us in terms of the principles and programs that make a big difference. And our job as behavioral health experts is to deal with these behavioral health epidemics by implementing the science that we have now. And as Tom was talking about it in terms of his remarks in the plenary, that science is going to get better. We're going to understand more granularly what's actually going on in terms of that neural wiring. But just like John Snow removed the pump handle and stopped the cholera epidemic, we are in a position to do the same thing as we continue to discover, as Pasteur and Cook later did, the specific elements that were causing those problems. So we're in a mess, a hell of a mess. Global life expectancy in this country, 20 years ago, we were 11th in the world. We're currently 50th in the world in terms of global life expectancy. I think everybody here knows, since we work in the healthcare business, that we have those terrible healthcare outcomes in the context of spending twice as much as every other industrialized nation per capita on medical care. We have the highest rates of mental illness in the world. The lifetime rate of mental illness in the United States, according to the National Comorbidity Study, is about 50%. 1 in 2 of us will meet criteria for a diagnosis at some time in our life. Mexico, the rate's about 25%. It's half of our rate. When people move from Mexico to the United States, their rate of mental illness is about 25%, the same as the rate in Mexico. 13 years later, their rate has increased to 50%. We're in a hell of a mess. We have 44 million people living in poverty in this country. We have some of the highest income inequality, which turns out that the distinction between the very rich and the very poor is probably more important than the absolute level of poverty in terms of its adverse effects on people's health. We have shown substantial decrease in terms of our academic ability. We're dropping in terms of the OECD nations, in terms of our mathematical literacy, in terms of our science literacy. We're in a hell of a mess. The costs of mental illnesses, social, emotional, behavioral disorders in kids, the IOM estimates to be about $247 billion in 2009. We inflated that forward. It's over $300 billion. It's about the same for people who have severe mental illness in terms of their loss of human capital. That's the equivalent to losing a Fortune 5 company each year, right? Only Exxon and Walmart had gross revenues over that amount of money. That's how much money we're losing from productivity in our system because of these behavioral health epidemics. So how did we get here? Well, we actually have a pretty good emerging general theory, and this again relates very much to what Bruce was just talking about. You know, we know now, when I was an undergraduate, way back in the Pliocene era, there was a lot of argument about whether or not there was any real genetic basis to mental illnesses. We now know from many studies that there's a heritable component of mental illnesses, but we also know, just like many other conditions, that gives you a sense of your risk profile, but biology is not destiny, right? So we know that if people who have certain vulnerabilities are placed in environments where they're traumatized or where they experience toxic stress, that increases dramatically the likelihood that they'll become ill. Now, pretty much everybody here familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, the ACE study, which is good because many audiences are not. It's amazing to me, still aren't familiar with that study. But basically what that showed is people who experienced adverse childhood experiences, particularly 4 or more, had much worse behavioral health outcomes. They were much more likely to be addicted, much more likely to be depressed, but they also had much higher rates of infectious illness and cardiovascular illness, et cetera. So this very much relates to what Jeff was just talking about. So it's vulnerability coupled with environmental exposure, and here we're talking about toxic stress and trauma. And Jeff was talking about the fact that we now know, and the more I look into this, the more surprised I am about how well developed and extensive a literature is available, that this results in rewiring of our brains. It affects cognitive functioning, it affects executive functioning, it affects emotional regulation. There's some work that was done by Gary Evans that showed people who were in toxic stress situations had dramatically depressed levels of cognitive functioning across a broad amount, like 3 standard deviation differences from people who hadn't experienced that. And that is, for any of you who, I don't want to traumatize you by reminding you about statistics, but for any of you who remember how big a standard deviation is, 3 standard deviation is a gargantuan effect. So that leads to behavioral health problems, right? This is speaking beyond our data currently, but someday we're going to understand that the sentinel conditions, and this fits very nicely with, I think, what Tom was talking about in his talk, the sentinel conditions for many chronic health conditions are, in fact, the behavioral health conditions. They are the things that show up first, right? We used to think that mental illnesses and addiction disorders were disorders of young adulthood. We now know that they're disorders of adolescence, early adolescence, right? That half of everyone who's going to have a diagnosis during the course of their life will have that diagnosis by age 14, right? Like Tom said, 3/4 by age 25. What else do we know? Another sad fact is, on average, those people will not get any treatment for 10 years. As they move through adolescence, through this important life launching, you have to get through high school, get some sort of post-secondary education, and we've known this for a long time. So what happens? Because of this relationship between vulnerability and stress starts to rewire the brain, depresses various kinds of cognitive and emotional functioning, academic achievement starts to drop, right? Some of the strongest predictors of people not completing high school are people who have social, emotional, behavioral disorders. So as academic achievement drops, what happens? Occupational achievement starts to drop, right? We see, particularly as we've been focusing recently on the unemployment rates and the unemployment rates amongst different groups of people, we've clearly seen that people who have less education have higher unemployment rates, and they're working at much less lucrative positions typically, right? So as socioeconomic status drops through compromised academic achievement, people live in poor situations, in more toxic situations, and so we have a perfect storm, right? such that you start with vulnerability, you add stress, causes brain damage of one sort or another, behavioral health problems, academic problems, occupational problems, poverty, which puts you at higher risk for stress, and that's how you start to get these multi-generational problems. And we have good data to understand that there are critical periods, particularly in prenatal development, early childhood development, where it's essential that we do things to try to ameliorate these stress. Now, the good news is we know a lot of things that work, that make a big difference. We actually have very strong longitudinal data on the effects of some interventions. The nurse-family partnership is one I think that's well understood. And even though those original studies were done over 30 years ago, it's finally getting rolled out around the country, right? This is where a nurse who's trained in the program visits young, poor moms for their first pregnancy and works with them for a period of 2 years. If we do that, we know that we decrease child abuse rates, right? One thing we want to do is we want to drive down trauma. We decrease child abuse rates by 48%. We increase the social emotional behavior of the children themselves. We decrease the rates at which the mothers get arrested, the rates at which they use Medicaid services. So there's good indication that that attacks many of these problems we're talking about in terms of our general theory. The Seattle Social Development Project is a project that works with kids, teachers, and parents, skill-based, skill-oriented, training parents to be a bit more effective, encouraging kids to take chances, and giving them feedback about how they're doing. This study, this is a randomized study. The Nurse-Family Partnership was also, I mean, these are absolutely first-rate, rigorous studies. The Seattle Social Development Project was grades 1st through 6, kids receiving treatment. This is 15-year follow-up data, right? Nothing systematic has happened to these kids over that 15-year data. What you can see is that by age 27, 15 years after the end of that intervention, there's a 38% reduction in diagnosable mental illness. That's why I think of these things, and this is where I would disagree with Tom a little bit. I think we have some behavioral vaccines. They're not 100% effective, but that's a pretty dramatic effect with no intermediate services being delivered. The good behavior game, and I thought that Justin Bieber was a perfectly appropriate person to talk about here, is a game that's played by first graders. It's actually getting a fair amount of press recently. It's very behavioristically oriented. You reinforce good behavior. You try to ignore bad behavior. You have kids work in teams, and they get prizes. First grade intervention. If you look at kids who had that intervention 13 years later, they're 21% more likely to have graduated from high school. They're 61% more likely to have attended college. They're dramatically reduced rates of alcohol abuse. These are like behavioral vaccines. There's no excuse, from my perspective, for every child in the United States not having access to one of these evidence-based practices. And you know what else? It's good for the economy, right? Because we're building human capital. There's a great organization in Washington called the Washington State Institute for Public Policy that was created by the legislature there, and their task is to estimate the cost and benefit of various types of programs. So they describe themselves as the portfolio managers for the state legislature. They make recommendations about where the state legislature should invest its money. And so they do a lot of cost-benefit analysis. So they estimate that an early childhood education program, for every dollar you spend, you get back $2.36. That nurse-family partnership, for every dollar you spend, you get back about $2.88. The social development project returns about $3.10. And the Grading Good Choices program is a much less expensive program, and for it you actually get $11 back for every dollar you invest. These are smart investments. And you know what? They're part of the legacy of the community mental health movement. Some people I can tell in the audience are from my generation, like I said, back in the Pleistocene era, and you'll recall back then that there was a very high vision for what community mental health was going to achieve. It was a lot more than I think what we have come to focus on in many, many states, which is really focusing on people with the most severe illnesses. And it's not that that's inappropriate at all, but I think it's time for us to start to reclaim what was our original vision. And I think that one of the things that distinguishes now from then is we now have science-based approaches to achieve many of the sort of ideologically inspired vision of the original community mental health movement, based on very well understood behavioral theory. And as you can see, in terms of sort of this theme of integration, very nicely integrated between biology and behavior, starting to break down this meaningless distinction between mind and body. So how do we get there from here? Well, we have to do basically the same exact things that we had to do in public health, right? So you see up there a little baby getting a vaccination, right? We have to make sure that we can implement those behavioral vaccines that we were talking about. And we actually have a fair amount of money that we spend in this country on various kinds of prevention interventions, not well coordinated, not well strategically managed. We need to do a better job there in making sure that every child has access to those programs. Every child, every mom and child has access to a healthy pregnancy. It's in our enlightened self-interest to do it. The malaria nets that we're trying to get distributed around the world, the insecticide nets that keep people from getting exposed to malaria. We need things like that to help buffer the effects of toxic stress. Things like income support programs, housing support programs for poor people, ultimately giving everybody kind of a fair shot to make a difference in terms of their life. So we need things that reduce community risk factors, family leave policies, and Jeff was just talking about his experience with a new baby. Family leave policies that support people so that moms and dads have an appropriate opportunity to attach to their children, which we know now, again, from lots and lots of research is critically important. The person getting the injection really talks about treatment, right? Jeff and others talked about the effects of trauma, and we talked now a lot about trauma-informed care. One of our legacies, an unfortunate legacy, I think, in our field, is a tension between prevention and treatment, right? Particularly from a preventionist perspective, because they think that damn treatment gets all the money, it always gets all the money all the time. We have to now realize that with this new integrated theory, it would be like saying, well, what do you want to give up? Vaccinations, which would be prevention, or antibiotics, which would be treatment? You say, well, that's a silly question. We need both vaccinations and antibiotics. In this area, we need both effective treatment for people as well as preventive interventions for them. So this is the call to action here and now. And we're a group that needs to be a stand for these kinds of problems. We've got the data. We have in our ideological DNA from the development of the community mental health centers movement a vision of community health, well-being, equitable opportunity, and we now have the science base that we know we can use to implement that vision. So number one, we need to integrate prevention and treatment. We need to get rid of this distinction between the two and realize, just like vaccinations and antibiotics, that if we're going to make the difference we want to make, we've got to have both preventive and treatment interventions. This notion about rediscovering community mental health, going back to our roots in a sense, but with a much more powerful science base than we had in the past. We need to lead the next movement in community well-being and productivity. I really see this as our legacy. To the degree to which that model is right, and again, Jeff's talk was a perfect lead-in for this, we now have the theory. We've got the amount of information we have is more than John Snow had when he removed that pump handle. We've done that careful work. It's time for us to implement that program. We need to generate political will. Julius Richmond, who's a giant in terms of public health, he was an assistant secretary of health. He started in Johnson administration. He was part of the war on poverty, started the Head Start program, said that you need three things to really make a difference. You need science, and we've got good science. We're going to get more. We're going to understand more about how all those networks are put together, et cetera, but we have got actionable science right now. You need to know how to implement it. And we're continuing to work on that. That's a challenge. This is the thing I think that Rich was talking about in terms of the quality of implementation, and he talked about the study, the RAND study that showed how poor across healthcare in general practices are relative to standards, and you need political will. So we need to be a stand for that. We need to be the people who say, look, we can in fact put a pipe into everyone's house to bring in clean water, and another pipe coming out of that house to remove waste safely so we don't infect ourselves. We need to think about it in terms of reducing economic inequality, promoting social programs that reduce toxic stress, making sure that every kid has access to an evidence-based prevention intervention program, making sure that every mom and family, I'm thinking principally of the prenatal period here, so dads are known to be part of this process as well. Every mom have access to prenatal care, adequate nutrition, et cetera, et cetera. We know what to do. It's a matter of marshaling the political will to get it done. We can't afford not to do it. It's in our enlightened self-interest to do it. And this is the group, I think, that needs to lead the next revolution in public health, which will be approaching and attacking these behavioral health problems. Thank you.
I'm Dennis Embry, and I'm a prevention scientist, and you're probably wondering, what in the heck is that? And I dress like a rock star. So I make music in people's brains and behavior at a whole population level. What I'm interested in is how to create wellness and well-being, peace, productivity, health, and happiness in whole cultures. I am a licensed psychologist, and I can do it at an individual level, but that's not what interests me. I want all of the children in Yukon, in Canada, in the US, and across the world to have the best lives they can. When ancient peoples and anthropological peoples meet, the two chiefs, they typically ask the question, how are the children? Now, they're not asking, how are your specific children? They're asking, how are the people's children? Well, not well. So they're really wanting to know, how are the people? Because as it turns out in anthropological society, the well-being and the survival of the culture always depends on how well the children are. And I'd like to explore with you, through some of the themes that have already been presented today and will be presented, how we might make Yukon one of the shining stars of well-being for all of our children. Okay? First off, I'd like you to think about your own children or your grandchildren or your children of choice. Children of choice are the strays that you pick up on the street. Does anybody here have children of choice besides me? I am actually one of those kids. Now, I'd like you to think about those children, your children, grandchildren, children of choice, and think about what you'd like to have them pack in their suitcase of life as they go out of your house, hopefully at 18, and don't return at 25 to live on your couch. So what is it that you would like them to carry in their suitcase of life? Now, normally I'd stretch this out, but I only have 18 minutes, so I want to hear at least a few pops of what you want in the suitcase of life. Self-confidence. What else? Work ethic. Pardon? Work ethic. Sense of humor. Passion. Open mind. Integrity. Great. Okay, let's see if this works. There we go. So, these are the kinds of things that people list all over the country, all over this country, all over the US, and in foreign countries when I go. And these are just a few of the things. These are deeply, innately coded desires in humans as the most pro-social species on the planet. We cooperate across all of the people that constitute our tribe. And our tribes are getting larger and larger. But if we don't cooperate, we are predators of one another. Now, I'd like you to think about something different, which is, what else do you want for your kids? What do you want for your kids' friends of friends and their friends? Same thing. Why? Because if they don't have it, the chances are your child will catch the contagion that is affecting the other children. So this is about whose children? Our children, everyone's children. Okay, so now think about the heavy loads that people could take in their life. A load of bricks in that suitcase or stones. What are the heavy things that you don't want the children to carry in their suitcases of life? Prejudice, death, addictions, fear, intolerance, shame. Great. Those are the kinds of things all across the world, the same things nobody wants them to have in the suitcase of life for their children. So, now, let's ask, what can we do to protect the futures of our children? What is it that we could do to make sure that their suitcases are lightly and well packed for life? And what could we do to keep the bricks out of them? But first, I need to take you on a tour of what is happening in North America. This is the National Comorbidity Study. The National Comorbidity Study measures the rates of depression in each succeeding generation. Now, this is not the result of overdiagnosis. My colleagues at the National Institutes of Health are smarter than that. But what this shows is that for each succeeding generation, I'm born in 1948, right there at 46 to 1955. I'm 64 this year, past year. And what you'll see is each one of those gradings, as a younger generation come on board, they're having an earlier depression, and a larger percentage of people are having a depression. Now let's think about what happens for the current generation. Draw the line in your mind. Now, for every young person who has a depression before age 18, they will lose the potential ability, they'll lose $300,000 in lifetime income. That's not a good thing. Plus the fact they're more likely to die from any number of diseases and disorders. Now, I'd like you to see the National Longitudinal Study in the United States. We've been following kids since the 1970s throughout their lives in panels. So by age 18, 25% of our young people in the United States will have an 35% will have an anxiety disorder by age 18. Now you might think that's not such a big deal. But does anybody here own a small business besides me? Or an agency? Okay, so you get an announcement today that you could apply for a contract or a grant or something, but you've got to get in the letter of intent by 5 o'clock today, and you give it to a young person who has an anxiety disorder. How's that going to work for you? Not well. And these are the young people who are likely to be abusing prescription drugs or engaging in heavy marijuana use. Now, 20% will have a behavioral disorder. These are the young people who are filling our jails in Canada and in America. 17% will have a mood disorder, and 25% will have a full-blown addiction by age 20. 25% will have a full-blown addiction by age 18. Altogether, 1 out of 2 of our kids in the U.S. will have one or more of these things by age 18. It's not as bad yet in Canada, but when we catch a cold, Canada can get the flu. Notice that it starts earlier. This shows that further. This is the Great Smoky Mountain study showing the cumulative rate and prevalence of psychiatric disorders among young people in the Great Smoky Mountains longitudinal study. 500 kids every 2 years. Now notice what happens. The next younger cohort, they're getting sicker faster. Now the next youngest cohort, they're getting sicker faster every 2 years. Has anybody noticed this besides me? And so what do we need to do? To pay attention to the early onset. By the way, the risk factors that Brendan talked about are genetically encoded in frontier conditions. There are 2 genes that are selected among Caucasian people, dopamine 2 allele 1 and dopamine 4 allele 7, that are related to sensation seeking, novelty seeking. Dopamine 4 allele 7 confers a 15-point IQ advantage, and both of these are highly associated with human migration. To go over to the next hill, you have to be smarter, you have to have some sensation seeking and risk taking. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. we wouldn't be standing here in the Yukon. And certainly the First Nations people wouldn't have come across all of that ice. So how many of you know a middle class or working class or maybe an upper class family that's reasonably intact with a child, a teenager or an adult child with a mental or emotional or behavioral disorder besides me? Okay? If you ask people to hold up their hands in North America, typically almost everyone will. But if you ask people in some of the other Commonwealth countries, only 1/2 of the people will show their hands. If you ask them from the northern Scandinavian countries, in Europe, or the lowland countries, in Europe, Belgium, the Netherlands, only 1/4 of the people will raise their hands. Why? It's not because they're in denial, it's because they are actually using the prevention science at a population level to protect the futures of their children. Now, Canadians are more likely to be using some of this science. In fact, we have the largest use of some of our scientific findings in Manitoba than in the United States. I call this euthanasia. It's not necessarily true that all of our kids are dying younger, but they're becoming more and more disabled and less able, less well. What can we do to change that? So, humans are the only intergenerational species where they transfer wealth and knowledge back and forth between the young generation and the old generation and the old generation back to the young generation. So if an older person is ill, we stay with them until they die, for example. No other species does that. Elephants will stick around for a while, but after a while they go, we got to go have lunch. But we stay to the end, and we invest in itty-bitty babies. Now that's breaking down because of all of this. And it affects multiple generations. It actually changes the expression of the genes through a process called epigenetic mechanisms. And because what's the principal predator of humans since the invention of stone tools? Other humans. And the principal source of safety for said humans? Other humans. So all of this is about friend or foe. So in the 1950s, we had a polio epidemic. I was growing up, and I was about 8 when I got my polio vaccine at Osborne Elementary School in Phoenix, Arizona. Who got the polio vaccines? Which kids? Everybody. We didn't ration it. We gave it to every kid. Why? Because every kid was at risk. Every kid in Yukon, in Canada, and in the United States is at risk for mental, emotional, and behavioral disorders that will have a lifetime adverse effect. And if they're not directly at risk, their friends are at risk, and they could be riding in a car or some other kind of risk factor. So we need behavioral vaccines like seat belts or brushing your teeth that you do daily to protect oneself from that. And good news, there are such behavioral vaccines. These are repeated actions, and they are protective. Here we go. So prediction makes protection and prevention possible. When the Weather Channel put on this video, what did the people do in New York and New Jersey and Connecticut? Batten down. Put sandbags out. Now, we didn't know which house might be destroyed or who might get killed, but we could say, bad stuff is going to happen. Take precautions. So we have similar things for Sandy Hook. So these are the basic early predictors. So low rates of psychological flexibility, high exposure to problematic behaviors, high exposure to toxic influences, and low reinforcement of pro-social behavior create those storms. But there are anecdotes to these things, behavioral vaccines, that embody these positive principles. This is from our article in the American Psychologist this past, I think it's in March. Now, watch this video.
Cherish them. I'm gonna kill you. How you would.
Protect them.
Jimmy, stop it!
And wipe away their tears.
I feel like I haven't got a minute. No, not happened. Because they're naughty.
Follow 5 families. on an emotional 2-month journey to a happier home life.
They don't realise it yet, but they're the ones who are going to have to change.
Driving Mum and Dad Mad, a brand new series tonight at 9.
That was broadcast on ITV against Desperate Housewives in the United Kingdom. And it was an 8-week television show showing parents explicitly how to help handling difficult situations at home. The heroes were not like Nanny 911. The heroes were the parents. And they learned how to do these things. That show has been shown to, empirically, to have reached more people, as I said, than watching Desperate Housewives. We were actually able to experimentally test the effects of it. And if we had tried to do the same thing by having people go see a practitioner in parenting supports, we would have to have trained almost 11,000 practitioners in the United Kingdom. Now, that basic study has been replicated 3 times. We've also done a population-level study in the United States. And by the way, that TV show only cost $200,000 to produce. So you get an idea of cost-effectiveness, okay? So when these kinds of things are done, universal access to parenting supports in our population-level study in the US, we were able to reduce official records of child maltreatment by 25% in 2 years for the cost of $15 per child. Maybe we should do that.
And parents of young children will find this next story interesting. It's about a game some Winnipeg students are playing in class. Their teachers say it dramatically reduces disruptive behavior. The National's Nella Ayed got an inside look at the pilot project.
A harmonica isn't known as a tool for keeping discipline, but in this classroom, that's all it takes to bring peace and quiet.
We're going to play the PAX game.
So much about the so-called PAX good behavior game seems to defy logic. It's surprisingly simple. Teams can be challenged to finish tasks on a timer or complete an assignment. And if one of them misbehaves, it reflects on the whole team.
Good job.
A mix of competition and positive reinforcement.
Great job. 0 spleens.
It's supposed to teach self-control. Since they've started playing it in September, their teachers say the change is extraordinary.
They're just so calm, relaxed, happy. They know what's happening. They know what the expectations are.
Now, that particular study is reaching 9,000 kids, and in the other studies, these are the kinds of things it reduces. These are exactly the kind of behaviors that Brendan was talking about earlier that can be powerful or they can be risk-taking. But just teaching these children essentially mindfulness and self-regulation in 1 year has lifetime effects that go at least until the 21st year, and now we're following them to the 30th year of life. Imagine that we did that. Oh, by the way, it costs less than any medical vaccine we give for children. Now, this is very quickly, I have to go through this. This is a case study in ancient wisdom. The Inuit used to eat a lot of fish, and many of them still do. Well, that confers. The Inukshuk points to the right thing for people. What that shows, for example, is when you use omega-3 fatty acid in clinical doses, it was the first study ever published to prevent first episode psychosis. That was important to us in Tucson. It didn't, nobody gave Jared Loeffner omega-3 fatty acid. The same kind of thing given to children in classrooms improves their spelling and writing abilities and reading versus placebo. There's the writing before, writing after. And I got to finish up. If you provide omega-3 fatty acid and vitamin D to people in the North Country, you have the potential to reduce schizoaffective disorder by 20% in their lifetime. That's not on TV. And what are the costs if we don't do anything? Well, if we did that little game they're doing in Manitoba, in the entire U.S., for every first grader, we could, if you don't do it, we're going to lose $18 billion. We'd lose $2 billion in Canada and $2 million here in the Yukon. Now, what are the steps necessary to do some of these things? Adopt some particular legislation like the Healthy Child Manitoba that makes these kinds of things possible. Set these things up as common pool resources. Our children are our future, and they need to be managed as common pool resources like Eleanor Ostrom talked about. We also need to create and select various behavioral vaccines to do all of this thing, and we need to create incentives, business incentives, to pay for success for our children's well-being. People are paid today for the illness behaviors rather than for the success, and there's a mechanism of doing this. We need a scoreboard. Just like you get a dopamine hit when you're playing a computer game, and we learned that in 1999, you get a hit when you play a handheld device, and the computer people know that we get a hit on the scoreboard at our sports teams, our hockey teams, but you can use the same principle to show change at a population level. We did this in Wisconsin and Wyoming, and we were able to reduce youth tobacco enormously in 2 years' time using that scoreboard things. The future, ladies and gentlemen, for our children is in our hands. Tamariki Wairua is Maori. It means children are the gift of the gods held in common. Tamariki Wairua Fataputi Nake, Nate Rengi. Kia ora. Thank you very much.